Good afternoon, class. My name is Chauncey Refutation, and today I'll be reading Ms. Jasmine Thomas's claim that the government lowering corporate income tax does not create jobs. Her secondary claims are, history shows that there is no assured correlation between lower corporate income tax and increase in job creation, and the money being used from the lower income tax barely goes back to the worker and is really used to create jobs. And finally, that lowering the corporate income tax rates in truth increases the national deficit, thus actually hurting job growth and worker wages. Okay, so first, I found that Jasmine's format of her speech was a bit misleading, as initially the evidence that she first used to back her claim appears to be an attempt to disprove her opponent's belief that history shows that there is no assured correlation between the lower corporate income tax rate and an increase in job creation. The way that she presents the evidence seemingly aims to prove a new claim that unemployment rates were at its lowest in a period of time when corporate income tax was at its highest. She says, the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that during the years of 1951 through 69, the income tax rates rose from 42% to 50%, while the unemployment rate was at a low of 3.3% and only moved to 3.5%. So I noticed how Jasmine emphasized the word only when referring to correlation between the unemployment rate rising at 0.2% as the income tax rate rose 8 during the 50s and 60s, and that made me feel as though she was stating that the rising of the income tax rate raised unemployment, but only on a minuscule level. This is why I feel as though Jasmine starts off her claim of fact speech a bit unclearly, and in doing so almost fits into a claim. So I feel that this information is unnecessary and doesn't help bolster her claim, but rather confuses her audience, because in the background section of her speech and the bullet point prior to this piece of evidence, she states that the corporate federal income tax was put in place in 1909 at a uniform rate of 1%, and that the rate today is 21% under Trump's Tax Act. So if unemployment moved up 0.2% from the corporate income tax rate rising 8% during the 50s and 60s, based on the evidence thus far, it would only make sense that a 30% drop of the income tax rate from that time would lead to the unemployment rate lowering to some degree as well. She then states that 15 million jobs were created within 5 years of a large corporate income tax being put into place in 1993, and that this occurred due to a tax act placed. This occurred due to a tax act put in place by President Clinton, which Jasmine states formed 4 additional tax brackets while also raising corporate income tax rates for businesses making over $335,000 in annual revenue. She continues stating that during its enactment, there was 3.8% job growth as unemployment fell from 6.8% to 3.9%. Also, industrial production increased 5.6% annually. And she ends citing that when Clinton left office in 2001, 21.4 million jobs were created. So that's a bit misleading there. The first fact that actually supports the initial claim made by Jasmine is that when the Tax Reform Act of 1986 was in effect, and income tax was reduced from 46% to 34%, as well as during times unspecified that rates increased for corporations making over $10 million, the nation's unemployment rate did not fluctuate and consistently stayed at 6.6%. However, this claim was not cited, so we're not sure which of her sources this information came from. But the next point that she brings up is that the money generated from a lower income tax rarely goes back to the worker and is rarely used to create jobs. She states that in 2004, a piece of congressional legislation was passed that allowed companies to obtain profits that were previously earned internationally at an income tax rate of 5% rather than the prior 35%, and then goes on stating that 15 corporations who benefited the most from this chose to cut 20,000 net jobs instead of creating more, which a lower income tax is thought to do. While this information does support the main claim, I feel as though this could be considered an outlier, as this is a piece of information of one event occurring in 1 year and not across a span of time long enough to claim that this is a definitive trend that takes place in the corporate world. The next claim made is that following Trump's Tax Act, which lowered the corporate tax rate, corporations gave out $171 billion to their shareholders, whereas only $5.6 billion went to their workers. And that a survey by Morgan Stanley showed that in total 43% of tax cut savings would go back to investors and only 13% would go to workers. The issue that I have with these pieces of evidence is that not only do they more so try to prove that lower income tax barely goes back to the worker, quote unquote, which essentially is not the crux of her main claim, being that lower income tax does not lead to more jobs, but it fails to take into consideration the expenses of funding an organization in relation to how much net profit these these corporations are able to reinvest into the workers, and or in the scenario more job positions or opportunities. The evidence claim of fact speech continues to bring up evidence about those corporations that receive tax cuts, but doesn't go into detail to how heavily their lack of initiative to reinvest in the creation of more jobs for the public affects unemployment rates. And lastly, she claims that the lowering of the corporate tax rate leads to lower government tax revenue, which in turn means less government funds that could be used to create workers' union programs and federal jobs. But again, fails to correlate this fact more specifically to how this really affects the nature of the job market and the current unemployment rate. Thank you.
All right, well, the response on the first point mostly seems to be about whether or not it has limited effect versus no effect, and I'm not exactly sure how important that issue is. The advocate did suggest that it doesn't have any substantial effect to lower the tax rates or increasing the tax rates don't have a substantial negative effect on unemployment, and you suggest it has a minimal effect. That's a slight dispute. I think that there's, that's basically a challenge on the way the evidence has been reasoned from, and I think you're making an okay inference here, but not one that's particularly strong, and any evidence that you had that suggested that there was an impact would have been really helpful here to make that argument stronger, but there isn't any of your own original research on this. All right, on the second part, by the way, you start sounding like you're making a critique of the argument at times instead of a response to the argument. The second part talks about the job rate and the number of jobs created during the Clinton administration after the Tax Act that went into effect in '93, and that's the advocate's argument. And your argument is that, well, in '86 when we had the first adjustment, there was basically no fluctuation in the tax rates either. So I guess what your argument is that the tax rates don't seem to have a positive or negative effect, and attributing the positive effect here to the tax changes is an unreasonable assumption. I think that's the point that you're trying to make. You have a tendency to kind of get caught up in the comparison of the numbers in the tax acts without necessarily telling us what the inference is that you want us to draw from some of those comparisons. And I think that needs to be a little bit clearer. On the next point concerning the we're back in like 2004 and it's another tax cut that's being evaluated. You suggested that this was an outlier effect. And I'm going, okay, well, why do you think it's an outlier? Why is it not typical? You don't have any reason. You just kind of assert that it's an outlier, and so we shouldn't trust it. And I'm going, well, there's no reason to believe that it's an outlier. You haven't given us any context or information to suggest that it was an unusual situation. So why, I just don't think I can reach the same conclusion that you're reaching in that particular point. And then the notion about how the money gets distributed later on. I do think you have a good argument here suggesting that that's not really relevant to whether or not it is beneficial to the unemployment rate. Whether or not the employees do get more money doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they have a job. I guess that's the difference that's going on there. That's a reasonable point to make, but it does seem a little picayune. I think that you probably need to clarify your claims a little bit more. You have a tendency to kind of get caught up in the minutia of the comparisons that are being made, and there's not a lot of evidence on your own part to justify some of the counterclaims that you are suggesting. I think you need a little bit more data on that regard. But it was clearly organized, and you did kind of come to grips with some of the reasoning that the advocate used. All right, thank you.